From the time of Moses until the time of Saul, God led his people through select representatives, usually prophets, priests, and judges. We've heard about Moses and to a lesser extent his brother Aaron in this role. The time between the Israelites leaving Egypt and getting their first king is about 400 years. Let's take a look at what happens during that time. The first destination after leaving Egypt was Mount Sinai, where Israel stayed for almost a year. During that time, God gave Moses the law, the Ten Commandments, as well as all the civil and ceremonial laws that Israel was to observe. About half the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and about a quarter of Numbers take place at Sinai. So it's not action in the strict sense of the word, but it's a record of God's words to Moses about how Israel is to conduct their lives. So that includes the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. It includes details for the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, Exodus 25. Also includes the details for all the sacrifices in Leviticus 1 and all the festivals, Leviticus 23. Again, from Exodus 19 all the way to Numbers chapter 10, that's 58 chapters, that covers less than a year. So not a lot of time goes by there. But let's take a look at two events that happen during that time. The first in Exodus chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." These are the very people who just a few months ago witnessed the Red Sea part so that they could escape the Egyptian oppression once for all. These are the very people who watched God attack the Egyptians 10 times, each plague directed against a different Egyptian deity. And some of them they were exempt from. The flies never showed up in the land of Israel, the land that the Israelites were occupying. Their livestock were never killed. They didn't die. But now Moses was taking too long on the mountain. He was taking too long. So they thought they needed a new God. It seems foolish, but is our rebellion really any different? Is today's evidence of God's grace and of his sovereign rule really inferior to that which was offered to Israel? Because of the Israelites' rebellion, over 3,000 lives were lost. But God was not changing his mind about leading them to the promised land. The other event to look at during the time at Mount Sinai is the census. What started as one family reunion worth of people relocating to Egypt became an entire nation, and the book of Numbers tells us how many. It records tribe by tribe the number of men 20 and up able to serve in the army. Note that the Levites were excluded for this purpose. There are still 12 names because Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, are both counted, although they are known as the half-tribes. It also makes sense that they are two of the three smallest numbers since they started a generation later than all the others. The number of fighting men being over 600,000, the total population, including women and children, must have been several million, with many estimates suggesting at least 2 million. This seems like a very large number of people to be traveling around together. But understand that the United States of America is ranked 145th in terms of population density. So if you live here, you probably have not been around a truly heavy concentration of people all that often. China, which is ranked 59th in population density, is the same size as the United States, but has more than 4 times as many people. So it was definitely a lot of Israelites moving around, but we should not think that that number is beyond plausibility. So those Israelites were on the move again in Numbers chapter 10, and grumbling again shortly thereafter. Numbers 11 describes the people complaining about food. At this time, God's already been raining down manna from heaven every day, so now he gives them quail to eat for a month. But the next big show of lack of trust in God is going to prove costly. 12 men were sent into Canaan to scout the land that God was giving them, and they brought back overwhelmingly a negative report. They came back and said that the men of Canaan would be too powerful to overcome. This opinion prevailed on the people. So God declared, "As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you." Thus began 4 decades of wandering in the wilderness. In fact, the Hebrew name of the book of Numbers is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness or in the desert, taken from the first sentence of the book of Numbers. Then the rest of the book shows us their activity during this time period. The book of Deuteronomy does not pass much time. It's mostly a recap of the events that have happened and the instructions that God has given. It does record the death of Moses, and he is succeeded by Joshua. Joshua was one of the 2 scouts who brought back a favorable report about Canaan. He has a book named after him, and it's all about battle. It describes the Israelites fighting against Canaan, and does include some well-known accounts. Joshua chapter 2 describes Rahab, the prostitute, showing kindness to Israelite spies, basically in the name of not setting herself up against the Lord and his will. Joshua chapter 6 is the fall of Jericho, where the Israelite warriors surround the city and march and shout and blow trumpets and then go in and take the city. Some of the latter chapters of Joshua describe the land allotments for the 12 tribes. To the west is the Mediterranean Sea. You can also see the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, with the Jordan River running between them, and Reuben, Gad, and part of Manasseh are east of that. The book of Joshua ends with Joshua challenging the people of Israel to remain faithful to God always. He somewhat famously says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then Joshua dies and passes the torch to the judges. Now, the judges are not judges in the modern English sense of the word, so don't think gavels and gowns in courtrooms. They are God's chosen instruments to deliver his people from various oppressions. They are essentially prophets, often mighty warriors. The period of the judges begins about 1375 BC. Because the Bible does not always give us information in chronological order, and because there's little external evidence to date the specific judges, it's hard to compile an exact timeline of the individual judges in order. But here's a list of them in the order in which they appear in the biblical record. Now, some of the judges get several chapters dedicated to them, while others get 1 or 2 sentences only. In general, the more familiar you are with the name, probably the more the Bible has to say about them. Let's take a look at a few of them and what they did, a few of their different accounts. First, Ehud. He was ironically a left-handed Benjamite who saved Israel from from Moab by killing King Eglon. You might remember the graphic detail of the fat closing in over the sword. Deborah was associated with Barak. Under them, Israel defeated a Canaanite threat, including General Sisera. Again, you might remember the graphic detail of the tent peg penetrating Sisera's skull. Gideon was a powerful instrument of God to defeat those oppressing his people. He was reluctant at times. He requested and received several signs from God, but eventually led an army of 300 to defeat the Midianites. Samson, probably the most remembered of the judges, had his struggles against the Philistines. God had given him unnatural strength, supernatural strength, so he always defeated his enemies whenever they came upon him. But Samson married a Philistine woman and also allowed a different Philistine woman to betray him. So he ended up sacrificing himself to defeat the Philistines one last time. So that's a very basic overview of some of the judges about whom we're given a little bit more information. Again, many of them we just get one sentence, their name and how long they judged Israel. The book is very thematic, though. It's very similar in how it lays itself out. Basically, you get the people did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and then God sent a foreign nation to oppress them, and then God sent a deliverer, a judge, to save them from that oppression. And it happens again and again. After that, the people did evil again. So it is very much a cycle, and is very much indicative of the overall trajectory of Israel. The very last verse of the book of Judges has been suggested as a theme for the entire book. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. What else is going on in the world? Sometime during the period of the Judges, much of modern-day Asia and parts of modern-day Europe are transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Bronze Age collapse is a term describing several civilizations falling within a short period of time. Illiteracy rose, trade was disrupted, and a bunch of cities were abandoned or destroyed, all due to a combination of political unrest, invasion, and even natural calamities from earthquake to drought. This would also be the time frame for the Trojan War, if indeed something remotely close to the Greek mythological story actually occurred. But before we get to the Kings, there's one more book of the Bible that takes place during the period of the Judges, and that's Ruth. Now, the last several verses of Ruth describe a genealogy of King David. This genealogy agrees completely with the one in Matthew chapter 1. The first name given, Perez, is the son of Judah, who probably died sometime around 1800. David was probably born about 1035. So how can you make it over 750 years in only 10 generations? This is, again, evidence that biblical genealogies are not necessarily all-inclusive, nor are they intended to be. We are not the original audience, so most of these names mean very little to us. But they were much more identifiable and relevant 3,000 years ago. However, looking at the bottom of the genealogy, the book of Ruth does specifically say that Ruth and Boaz had a son and named him Obed. And we also know that Jesse was indeed the father of David. So even if there are gaps in the genealogy, there would have to be a significant gap between Obed and Jesse to keep the happenings of the book of Ruth from being placed near the end of the period of the Judges. So what about Ruth? Well, Ruth is a short book following a woman named Naomi, who lost her husband and her 2 sons in a foreign land in a short time. Eventually, she returns to her own land with one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth. Back home, Ruth met and married Boaz, and their son is in the direct messianic line. That is to say, he is an ancestor of Christ. Again, the theme of God's grace persists. Even while his hand-picked people are rebelling against him, he continues to bestow favor on them, both collectively and individually. Today, the United States of America is hardly a nation that collectively seeks to worship God or pursue his will, but it's not hard to see the blessings that God refuses to withhold from us, both collectively and individually. I'm Pastor Clinton. God bless your efforts to study his story.